So welcome everyone to European Guanxi's last webinar of the year. I'm Barbara, Vice President of European Guanxi, and I'll be the moderator for this event. The topic for today is Another Way of Looking at Things, Eurocentrism, Philosophy, and Worldviews. It is a great pleasure to have Thomas Kingston as our guest speaker. Thomas Edward Kingston holds an MA in Pacific Asian Studies from SOAS and an MPhil in Chinese Philosophy, Religion, and Culture from the Renmin University of China, where he was International Excellence Scholar from 2018 to 2020, and his thesis was awarded the highest grade of that year. He worked as a research assistant at the School of Philosophy of Renmin University, where his research focused on comparative moral, political, legal philosophy. He produced papers on topics such as virtue jurisprudence, human nature in Chinese and Western thought, and the rule of law. He was the only foreigner at the International Confucianism Forum in 2019, where he presented on the rise and fall of man, human nature in Xunzi and John Wesley. He's a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and Ireland and a member of the British Postgraduate Network for Chinese Studies. He was recently named Huayu Enrichment Scholar for 2021, as nominated by the British Association for Chinese Studies and the Ministry of Education of the Republic of China. We hope you enjoyed this webinar and join the discussion at the end. Please, Mr. Kingston.
Okay, so thank you for coming today, and thank you for Barbara for that lovely introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about another way of looking at things. Barbara's already explained the title. It's there. You've seen it numerous times. I won't dwell on it. I'll briefly revisit a little bit about me. So I'm British. I had absolutely no background in philosophy. I studied law. And whilst I was studying law, I had this really quite a deep interest in sort of the more moral and shall we say the less practical aspects of law. And I wrote my final paper for my law degree on what it means to be human in legal sense. And as I was looking to put that into a practical setting, I ended up working in Cambodia as a human rights with a human rights law group, which was really interesting, and that really changed my outlook. I hadn't really travelled to Asia that much, and all of a sudden I was brought into contact with very different cultures, very different traditions, and I think what was most apparent was that the bubble that I'd sort of grown up in terms of values and conceptualizations were actively being challenged. In Cambodia, we had the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, and there was also ongoing issues related to political things and sort of what we would call fundamental freedoms in the West. I've ended my Pacific Asian Studies at SOAS. Didn't focus on China really that much at this point. I contextualized my interest in Southeast Asia with a bit of China. So I did the economics of China, I did Chinese history, but mainly I did history, politics, law, and I wrote my dissertation at SOAS on the sort of intellectual history of revolutions in Southeast Asia and their ideological setting. I got a distinction there. I then went on to a sinological summer school. I got an email out of the blue that went around everybody at SOAS and said, one of our alumni is running a summer school. And this was a really great opportunity. It opened my eyes. It was at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, National Taiwan University, and Peking University, and involved instruction in sort of the basics. It was like a sort of a 101 and a retreat to a monastery. So sort of Chinese philosophy from right to the back to the now. And then I went and studied an MPhil in Chinese philosophy at Renmin, which Barbara has gone through in English. And that was really good. Great opportunities to learn and develop. So what this isn't. Most people start with an introduction to their thing and they say what it's going to be. Well, and I'm hoping this doesn't disappoint anybody, but I'm going to clarify some things here about what today isn't going to be about. So it's not going to be a Chinese philosophy 101. As much as I would love to cover everything from Confucius to Kang Yue and everything in between, and even more modern Chinese philosophy. It's not really practical, and there are people who do it better than me, and I'm more than happy to recommend books on that if anybody wants some more information. So we're not going to be really tackling that today. Nor is it going to be one of these ancient advice for modern, insert something here. So it's not going to be the art of war for the boardroom, nor is it going to be the Parents' Dowdaging or the art of war for dating. These are quite bizarre in my opinion, but people have to make a living, I suppose. Nor is it definitive. What I really want to emphasize is what I'm talking about today is very much it's a work in progress. It's part of a broader movement. I use movement in quite a loose term. It's more of an outlook and a change in opinion. But it's not meant to really force anybody to do anything, nor is it really it's not an authority. It's not like an authoritative announcement that everybody has to follow. So I just want to make that clear. So what is it? Well, it's provocative. I want it to be something that makes people think. I want it to be something that challenges maybe preconceptions and maybe outlooks, and just it acts as a sort of a foundation for debate and further development. It's an invitation. It's an invitation to participate within this. As I say, I use the word movement loosely, but it's an invitation to participate within this and be part of something, be part of a change, be part of a pattern, and hopefully something that's positive. I mean, that's what I would like to emphasize throughout, is that it is ultimately something that's, I see as quite a positive thing. So, what is the state of play? Right, well, I thought I'd open it up with a little something. So, if you haven't sort of guessed by the title, one of my issues is that I feel that philosophy and, shall we say, the Western outlook is too Eurocentric. We value, not value, should I say, there's too much emphasis on Western traditions and history as if without accepting them as part of a much more diverse and cosmopolitan world framing. Now, there's nothing wrong at all with being passionate about Western history or Western traditions. It has a lot to offer, and that's great. But there are some, there's a lot of things to be gained, and that's once again part of the point of this thing. There's a lot of things to be gained from broadening our horizons. So, Confucius actually got referenced in a US Supreme Court case a few years ago, and it was actually the Supreme Court case that legalized gay marriage across America. And the Chief Justice, Anthony Kennedy, in his arguments quotes Confucius and Cicero by emphasizing that there's universal or shared centrality of marriage within the human, he calls it the human condition. And in his dissenting remarks, Justice Antonin Scalia, a noted conservative in the court, he said, in not very nice terms, and you'll see why. He said, the Supreme Court of the United States has descended from the disciplined legal reasoning of John Marshall and Joseph Story to the mystical aphorisms of the fortune cookie. And that kind of really struck me because, I mean, it's very patronizing, and I mean, mentioning that Confucius shares something with the West and it's sort of it's a shared value definitely doesn't deserve the treatment of reducing it down to something from a fortune cookie. So yeah, so not great. So the elephant in the room, another, this is a bit of an analogy this time. And this is actually, you've probably heard it before, so I will try and keep it brief, but this is actually, I believe it's an Indian tale. And so there's 6 blind men that live in a village in India. and the villagers look after them. They're born blind, and they've never been able to see. And the men are curious about the outside world, and they hear that the local king, the Raja, his daughter rides around on an elephant. And they're kind of confused because the other thing they've heard about elephants are they scare people, they cause a lot of damage. So they go, well, okay, this is the daughter of the king. Surely she's very valuable. Like, why would he put her on something that's so dangerous? And they argue. And the first blind man says, it must be a powerful giant, because I've heard stories that it can build roads and it can flatten forests. So it's a giant that carries this princess around. And the second one says, no, you're wrong. The elephant is graceful and gentle if a princess can ride on its back. The third one says, no, I've heard that an elephant can kill people with its horn. He says horn, but we'll do that later. And the fourth one says, you're all mistaken. It's just a giant cow. You know how people exaggerate. These stories get back to us. And then the fifth one says, it's magical. That's how she can travel throughout the kingdom. The sixth one says, well, I don't believe they exist at all. You've all been part of a joke. So the villagers get sick of them arguing. This has been going on for a long time. And they agree to send them to the capital. So they go and meet the Raja, and they're introduced one by one to the elephant. And the first man reaches out and he touches his neck and says, oh, the elephant is very solid. It's very strong. It must be very powerful. It's like a wall. Second blind man puts his hand on the trunk and he says, oh, actually, it's a bit like a snake. The third blind man touches its tusk and he goes, well, I was right, because this is very sharp and deadly and this could definitely kill someone. Fourth blind man touches its legs and he says, yeah, I was also right. It's got 4 legs. It's just a big cow. The fifth blind man touches its ear and he finds something that's quite thin and flappy, and he goes, oh, well, I think I might have been right too. It's magical. Maybe it's a magic carpet that she flies along. And the sixth blind man, the unbeliever, he gets hold of its tail and he says, oh, well, this is just a piece of old rope. And so they carry on arguing. Eventually, and they say, right, the first blind man says, the elephant's a wall. We can agree on that. The second man says, no, it's a snake, not a wall. The third man says, it's a spear. The fourth man says, it's a cow. The fifth, a giant carpet. And the sixth says, no, still lying to us, it's a rope. Eventually this wakes up the king, and the king comes out and he says, right, I'm going to settle it for you. He says, how can each of you be so certain that you're right? He says, the elephant is a very large animal and you've only touched one part. But if you put all the parts together, you will see the truth. And to me, that's sort of the central message of what expanding the philosophical curriculum and our outlook is all about, really, is it's about seeing the whole picture. Because until we reach that point, we are, no matter if you are the most versed person in classical Greek philosophy or one particular Greek philosopher, you're still only really touching that tusk, or you're touching the trunk and you're going, oh, well, I know all of it. And to me, that's not in a position I'd really like to be in, and I'm hoping, since you're here, that you'll join with me. So, to deal with the Eurocentrism a bit on, if we deal with what is philosophy, this is probably a very simplistic thing, but it comes from the Greek, philos, to love, and sophos, knowledge. So it's the love of knowledge. And whatever form, I think that's what should be focusing on, is what we're looking at. Does it fit this criteria? An analogy might be, if we think about something like coffee. Now I'm sure that I know that Italians are very passionate about coffee, and I would imagine probably don't have a very high opinion of American coffee. And then when we talk about Vietnamese coffee, it's a completely different thing. But they are all, whether you like them or not, they're all coffee. But not only are they all coffee, but they all tell us something. So if we look at coffee culture in America, we can learn something about maybe consumerism. We can learn about American societal dynamics. We can learn about the market system. If we look at coffee culture in Vietnam, we find that condensed milk plays a role. Condensed milk is to do with the colonial introduction. So, yeah, so whether we agree with it or like it, it doesn't really matter. And that's what I'm saying back about the definitive thing, is that, but we can still learn from it. So I would like to emphasize another emphasis, a few of them, is that I'm not arguing that you have to accept what non-Western teachings, whether they're Chinese or things, are right, but we need to at least engage with them. And we see this Eurocentrism a lot. I picked up a book the other day, and it's a new book about how influential Gutenberg was and how printing changed the world. And it opens up and it has this sort of brief discussion of how the Chinese invented printing, and it mentions briefly that they invent the movable type, but it's like, no, but Gutenberg did it. And to me, that seemed like they were neglecting the Chinese element, because they thought it would make Gutenberg's accomplishments less impressive. And that's not how I see it at all. I see that these are all complementary. You can say, wow, okay, the Chinese did this, but Gutenberg did it like this, and it played such a big role in this way. And they're not competitive. They are complementary, and they can exist together. But going back to purely philosophy, the West has taken a pretty dim view of Chinese philosophy in general. I'm talking about Chinese philosophy, though this can apply to all philosophy. Kant once said, philosophy is not to be found in the whole Orient, and then went on a sort of passage about infanticide, which and how horrified he was by it. And that sort of ignores that there were Confucian and there was Buddhist works against this, and that infanticide was a problem in Europe as well. This is not a uniquely Chinese or non-Western problem. Hegel said, there's no speculative philosophy. There's a certain amount of practical wisdom, but it would have been better if Confucius' works hadn't been translated. Pretty tricky to grasp. I'm sure my life would be a little bit translated. But at the same time, that doesn't stop me seeing that he plays a role in the development of philosophy. Heidegger said that, he didn't understand why people talk about Western philosophy, because he said it's tautology. He said all philosophy is Western because it comes out of Greece. And more recently, I believe this is the early 2000s, Jacques Derrida visited China and told the Chinese that they don't have philosophy, they only have thought. So, yeah, not a great state of play. But it hasn't always been that way. In fact, Western philosophy has historically been quite adaptive and adoptive in its thing. So we think about great philosophers that sort of change things. We think about Thomas Aquinas is a huge philosopher and theologian. He really changed people's the theological views on God and human nature and these things. And he does this by actually rejecting the dominant Platonic form of thinking about God. And he brings in Aristotle, which has sort of been resurrected or kept alive via Islamic thinkers, and he integrates this into like classical theology. And I mean, Christianity itself is a very good example of adaptation. After all, it is a Middle Eastern religion that then adopted bits of Hellenistic philosophy and has then adopted pre-Christian traditions, such as Christmas, etc. Like these are whether that's linked to the Northern European Yule or you link it to Roman festivals. This is the process that borrows. And when I'm talking about China in particular, the Jesuits that went over there were hugely impressed, and Leibniz said that he thought the I Ching was a great example of binary system, because it reduced everything into yes or no, or a 1 or a 0. And one of his followers, Christian Wolff, was also impressed with China, because he said, well, it shows us that morality can exist free from any evidence of like any sort of thoughts about God or that sort of thing. I mean, that's up for debate, but when we talk about conceptions of God, but like this shows that it had a role. Even sort of economic concepts sort of slipped in. Apparently, one of Louis XV's advisors, Francois Quesnay, borrowed or was inspired by with his endorsement of laissez-faire economics, because he'd read about the sage King Shun and his Wu Wei, this effortless inaction, effortless action, this inaction, sorry, where you just sort of let things flow, a concept from Taoist philosophy, and German philosopher that thought very differently to Hegel, Schopenhauer, borrowed things from Buddhism. So philosophy hasn't always been exclusive in terms of where it's getting its sources from, and it's limiting itself if it does get exclusive. I mean, another analogy, I probably need to stop doing these, but maybe boring people, but the way I see it right now is it's like going to a party, and I have lots of friends from all over the world, so they all bring a dish from their own culture. But rather than tasting everything and going, oh, I don't like this because of this or that or that, it would be like me going, oh, I'm only going to eat English food. So, I mean, we struggle here. It has to be beige, so probably fish and chips. And anything that isn't English food, not only do I not like it, but I refuse to categorize it as food. I mean, that would be ridiculous, and it would probably reveal something about my character, and people would probably think less of me. Yet, philosophy has been doing this in the academic sense for such a long time in the academy. And as I said, there are other people who are influenced, but broadly, the academic pursuit of philosophy has been exclusive and has been heavily Eurocentric, and it's ultimately reductive. Okay, but why should you care? I mean, you're here, so I assume you care, or you're at least interested, but why should you care? Well, first of all, I think a sense of balance is key. I borrowed these facts I've got here from Brian Van Norden, who's a really, really good Western exponent of Chinese philosophy. He teaches at Vassar College in America. He gives the example that among the top 50 philosophy departments in the United States that grant a PhD, 6 have a member of the faculty that teach Chinese philosophy. Outside of that, only 3 teach Chinese philosophy. So there's 9 probably in the entirety of the United States that teach Chinese philosophy within the philosophy department. 6 doctoral programs in the only 6 in the entirety of the United States teach Indian philosophy, and only 2 of those are in the top 50. And I found this really remarkable. Only 2 US doctoral programs in the Americas, in the United States, should I say, teach Indigenous American philosophy, which, I mean, it's not surprising, but it seems pretty shocking given that this is like a native and indigenous tradition that they should be drawing upon. But it also demonstrates a disregard and a hostility to enrichment in that sort of sense. And I think, when we talk about enrichment as well, like this goes back to a buzzword, I suppose, at the moment, like diversity. And I think we need to realise that diversity isn't just about ticking boxes. It's not about having X, Y, Z number of people from N minority or N belief system or N country in our department because it sounds good. There is a genuine argument that their diversity, their range of experience, brings something that a sort of more traditional Eurocentric philosophy would be missing. So, yeah. Secondly, the reason you should know is globalisation. Once again, probably why you're here. We are increasingly aware that the world is globalised. Ideas, culture and cuisine, etc. are all shared, and hopefully we're moving away from a model where this is sort of imperialist extraction, as in like British people going around the world and fighting with people, and rather it's an exchange, but with that exchange there come other things. There comes ongoing relationships, there's migration. The world is becoming a much smaller place in terms of travel, well, maybe not at the moment, but in terms of connections and things like that. So it's in our interest to know more about, and in particular interest, surely China stands out, and once again why you're here, because not only does it have this rich tradition of competing philosophies. I mean, that's the other thing, is that Chinese philosophy, I'm talking about it roughly in a monolithic group, but there are numerous schools that we still have on record, and probably 10 times as many that have gone out of existence, that have competing views and have a rich history of textual analysis and outlooks that inform sort of societal conditions. And I don't want to go into the Chinese people wear masks because of Confucianism sort of derivative thing we see, because that's an oversimplification. But just as Christianity has informed Western society, I mean, that's often what people mean when they say Western society is sort of a Hellenistic Christian synthesis. This is the Chinese philosophy informed Chinese society, whether it's things like the mandate of heaven. And once again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily definitely active now, and it's not one of these ancient wisdom now in the modern times, and we can draw parallels. But it definitely plays a role and definitely plays an influence. And if we ignore that, it's our loss, in my opinion. And we can engage and understand with this, and it contextualizes our relationships and contextualizes our outlooks regarding that. But it's also enriching. So as I mentioned before, I think diversity is key, and as I say, that doesn't just mean ticking boxes. It means a range of opinions and inputs. Whilst it's the norm for quote unquote pale, male and stale academics, and that's probably me included, the wider society isn't like that. And I think especially higher education, and probably philosophy even more so, that have these lofty goals of knowledge production, of cultivating leaders, of all these things, they need to be representative of the range of viewpoints of the people that are present, not only in our own societies, but around the world, for further engagement. And secondly, self-improvement. As I mentioned before, if you engage in dialogue with people, you stand a much better chance of understanding their outlook, sympathy, whether you take this as an intellectual thing. So if we're going down a sort of moral self-cultivation, you want to learn to meditate, or you want to learn the historical context of filial piety or something like that, that's great. But at the same time, it's also fine to do it for sort of, shall we say, self-enrichment. It's also fine to be like, do you know what, I really want to understand the cultural background of Chinese history, or I want to understand Theravada Buddhism, in better to understand, say, Southeast Asian cultures. And that's fine. And to engage with that, and even if you want to make money out of that and become a success business-wise, that's also fine. You need to know your market, but it is key, and that's what you have. That's what's enriching about it. And it also helps us learn. I mean, this is kind of the intellectual point that I raised in the self-improvement thing. But when we start to learn about Chinese philosophy, and this was a shock for me, we realise that sort of bigs that play a prominent role in sort of Western philosophy, and my focus is, as I said, as Barbara said, political philosophy. So one of the key ones for me was looking at. Thomas Hobbes has this argument that we have this state of nature, that if humans don't have rules, have society, we would basically, it'd be anarchy, and it'd be not very nice. And that seemed a huge thing at the time. But almost 2000, I thought, well, at least 1500 years earlier in China, we had Mengzi making the argument that no, humans are inherently good and we just need to cultivate this. We have Mozart saying that no, people don't argue because they're evil or they're simple-minded. It's because they have different point of views and they want different things. And even there's Shunzi is a philosopher that's compared to Hobbes a lot, and even he recognizes that in a way that's ahead of his time. He talks about the role of rituals, and he says how rituals are good for society. And he doesn't attach a mystical significance to it, but rather he attaches a psychological significance. And he says that so remembering the dead, that he knows that burning incense doesn't actually do anything for the dead, but what it does is it helps to remember the people, and it remembers their good examples, and that helps with our moral self-cultivation, which helps with society. So these are all things we can learn, and as I say, they're complementary. This is not saying, oh, sorry, Thomas Hobbes is rubbish because you've got beat to it or he's contested. This is, oh, that's really interesting that was a parallel development, or that also came about, and that's something we can definitely talk about. I mean, bring in another discipline now. There's a very notable book and series in art theory called Ways of Seeing. And then the entire point of that is if you change your perspective by a few degrees, you can see something almost completely new. And it talks about art through that prism. That art depends almost as much on the perceiver as it does the creator. And that's, my opinion, is what the world and sort of learning is like. And if we change our perspectives or we integrate more perspectives, it's a little bit like taking a panoramic picture on your phone. You're stitching together images and you get a more complete picture. Hopefully without the wiggly bits that happen if you're not very steady though. Okay, and here's one of my favourite quotes from one of my favourite philosophers, Zhuangzi. He says, "A frog in a well cannot discuss the ocean because he is limited by the size of his well. A summer insect cannot discuss ice because it knows only its own season. A narrow-minded scholar cannot discuss the Tao because he is constrained by his teachings." So we have to think, do we want to be that frog stuck in a well? Or do we want to jump out of it and realise there's oceans out there, that there's a whole earth out there? Do we want to be that summer insect that lives a short, fleeting life? And, I mean, not that ice is necessarily the most amazing thing to know about, but it's certainly better to know more things than less things. And I do want to be narrow-minded scholars that cannot discuss the Tao or the way because we're constrained by our teachings. No, I mean, we're always going to be constrained by our teachings, but surely it's about pushing boundaries, it's about moving forwards. And that's basically the crux of the argument. So what next? What can you do to do this? You can read. There are numerous short pieces in a range of outlets, whether they are China focused or they are general newspapers. There's a really good article there's a really good article on this topic actually, that revisits many of the themes by Brian Van Norden in the New York Times, and he talks about this at length. There are also introductions to Chinese philosophy. You can get source books, you can get comparative texts, you can find quite a lot of information out there. You can go and study it if you want. Yeah, but that would maybe a little bit much for some people because it's not everybody's cup of tea. But yeah, the point is you can read, you can do that. You can discuss it. One of the things I really love about a lot of Chinese and Greek philosophical writings is they're framed in the form of a discussion. It's a conversation and or discourse. So we have this relationship between teacher and pupil, or between pupil and pupil discussing things. And we don't have to obviously keep that hierarchy or anything, but discussing things really helps you understand. It helps you hammer out those queries, and it helps us move forwards. And we can gain insight from those around us. I mean, the whole point of this is getting other people's perspectives. And that can be simply as somebody else in a classroom, in a reading group, or a friend, like gaining more insight, more complete picture. And we can think. Even if you do nothing else, just think about it. Think about how possibly your perspective has been limited, or your perspective could be enriched. I mean, I think that's a much better way to look at it, rather than thinking about in a negative, that how can we enrich our perspectives, and start to implement that. And as I say, once again, this isn't about sort of practicing Tai Chi or like practicing meditation. Like, you don't have to be doing that sort of implementation, but it can literally be just a little bit of curiosity, or just a consideration about knowledge production and possibly the biases of scholarship, that sort of thing. And actually, that brings me to the end of my presentation. I think I've actually run out of time. So thank you, and any questions? I believe Barbara is going to take over now.
Thank you for your great insights on this fascinating topic. Before we move to the audience questions, I just have a few questions for you. In an increasingly polarized world, both at national levels and on the international scene, mutual understanding is now more than ever crucial. As such is the driving aim and principle of European Guanxi. You've given us a lot to reflect on, and it seems that we should, in our daily lives, move away from ethnocentrism and towards cultural relativism. Do you believe this to be the case? How do we implement this?
So, the issue of relativism is one that I thought long and hard about. I mean, it comes with political implications as well. And I think that's something we need to be careful about generally. I don't think you need to accept something as, shall we say, rights, and don't believe necessarily in sort of the plurality of truths as put forward by sort of postmodernist thought, like that there are individual truths for each person and they all exist. And I'm also not necessarily sure, like epistemologically, I'm quite confused in this sense, that in terms of truth, I'm not really sure what's going on there. But my point being is that I don't think anybody needs to necessarily adopt what they're reading. Do you know what I mean? Like I was brought up in a Catholic household. I've read the Quran. I didn't become a Muslim, but you can adopt this and you can learn from cultures in that way. So yeah, there's definitely a thing to move away from ethnocentrism, and I would say it's more about multicultural appreciation and intercultural communication necessarily than a relativism. It's not about saying, oh my God, this is right, like let's adopt it, or yeah, this explains everything, but rather it's like, oh, okay, that's food for thought, and that can help inform your decisions.
Thank you. So the second question we would have before moving to the audience questions would be, at a time of increasing nationalism and populism, how do national identities play a role in Western understanding of their cultures, of other cultures? And how can we as Europeans find a balance between that, European identity, and multiculturalism?
I think this is a really good question. It's a really good topical question as well. I mean, I think, I don't think I need to mention names, but I think there's two blonde politicians, one quite close to home and one on the other side of an ocean, that are possibly quite well known for, shall we say, knee-jerk behaviour, for not necessarily contemplative approaches to things. And I mean, I think that's the thing. I mean, for me, is that the more I learned about Chinese philosophy, the more I learned about Indian philosophy, the more I learned about a big range of philosophies, because the other neglected philosophies are African, they're indigenous American. The more you learn about them, the more you start to think, you start to consider your actions, and it's like a filter. And so I think that's a very key role to play. And in terms of ethnic identity or sort of nationalism, I think parallels, I think finding out similarities, and I think that obviously reduces it. If you go, okay, and I think, sorry, in a way, I think that is also part of maybe the rejection of it, is there is this idea, an almost fragility around, we don't like the idea that we are maybe threatened, we're maybe not the unique philosophical intellectual powerhouse. So, I mean, one of the examples is that we can see that Pythagoras' theorem emerges in the writings of Euclid, but independently it's appearing later, but a few hundred years later, it's also appearing in China. And this, to me, is, like, I think this is great. I mean, I think, like, it's a flourishing of humanity, it's a flourishing of how great humans are, and I think that's more what we need to focus on, is the positive bit we can get from this, because not only is there understanding, but there's also an appreciation. Like, all of a sudden, I mean, I'm not expecting people to be like getting excited for like for another country's football team to be winning, to be beating them, but at the same time we can be like, oh wow, this is pretty interesting that this happened here. Yeah, I mean, like, you look at Confucius and what people in the British Isles were doing at the same time. We were living in like mud huts, and I mean, okay, we built Stonehenge, but no one really knows what was going on there. Whereas this is like a fully flourishing sort of political, moral framework that just would be unmanageable. And it's written down. I think that's the other key point, and that's one of the wonders of Chinese philosophy, is that it is written down. So I think, so to summarize it, shared appreciation for the cultures, which is great. I mean, if you can feel happy for somebody else, that's better than getting angry at them, surely. Because the Buddha says something about it. He says, being angry at somebody is like, well, there's two sayings, but one, it's like drinking poison yourself and expecting the other person to die. So what we're going to do, let's just stop taking the poison and let's move forwards. And secondly, as I said, it shares a similarity. Once we realise similarities, we realise we have a lot in common, and or we at least have a platform to start discussing things. I mean, I don't really want to get into this, but one of the really interesting platforms moving forwards, I think, is going to be something to do with human rights, where we're going to have to find shared values in that sense, rather than going, we can't do like the intellectual equivalent of gunboat diplomacy and be like, oh, you've got to accept human rights because we say so, we're the West.
Thank you. So let's move on to the audience questions. Elena will be the first one to ask.
First of all, thank you for the brilliant presentation, and thank you to the webinar team for organizing this, and to Barbara. You've kind of partly addressed my question, but I will ask anyways. So what do you think we can we, as the West, or better as Europeans, what can we gain from Eastern philosophy? Or on the contrary, maybe what do you think could be the limits or the shortcomings of Eastern philosophy when applied to the Western context?
Okay, I think the second part of that question is especially really interesting. So the gain thing, I think, is quite easy, and as you say, I think I tried to answer that. But our limitations can sort of be explored within that, and I think that's that this, as we find limits to what we can gain and or possibly losses or challenges, we can come to know more about ourselves. So I mean, if we we sometimes realize that we can't apply things universally. Like there's the example I'll give. So when the Jesuits first go to China, there's the Chinese rights controversy. They can't work out whether Confucianism is like a rival to Christianity, whether praying to ancestors is problematic, etc., etc., etc. And that became political, and that's another thing. But at the heart of that, it was this assumption that because it copied what we did, it was the same. Like, as in, it's praying, so therefore it's to a deity, rather than think about things a different way. And I think there are limitations in that way. So in the sense that we, I'd say people say for better or for worse, but we grow up in a, as I say, like a Western environment that is dominated by Christian-based philosophy, based on Hellenistic philosophy. And there are going to be certain sort of perceptual/conceptual barriers to that. Like, I don't think it's very easy for someone from a Western background to necessarily fully engage with the Chinese concept of heaven. Is it a god? Is it a normative thing? Is it a natural force? This is confusing, and at the same time, it can be hard to apply things like, what is religion in the Chinese context? Like, is Confucianism religion? We end up with these problems. So yeah, I don't think we have much to lose, but I do think there are barriers to a full appreciation in the. It's kind of like reading a translated book. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's always much better when you read it by the original author, and you can change the meaning quite a lot via translation. So yeah, I mean, I suppose go and learn Chinese and read it, but yeah, there's a cultural thing as well. So I hope that's answered your question a little bit. It's quite a tough question to answer. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Our second question will be coming from Julius.
Right, your argument seems to establish that we should abandon the tendency towards Eurocentrism that is dominant in academia, and try to look beyond our own localized intellectual traditions. But I was wondering, does your argument, so I think there's two things that you talked about that it might establish, and I wasn't quite sure. Maybe you can clarify that. So is it more that you argued that, well, we should learn about Chinese philosophy, talk about Chinese philosophy, but as a spectator, right? Appreciating that this is a tradition in its own right, and taking it as, or taking learning about Chinese culture and philosophy as an advantage in what you talked about, globalization, intercultural communication, and these things? Or does your argument go a step further and tries to establish that Western philosophy should actually engage with Chinese philosophy, engage with the claims? Because if the latter thing is the case, then I was wondering, isn't there some kind of fundamental gap between them? Earlier you said something like, well, those philosophies can mutually exist they don't all have to be true, they can mutually exist. But isn't that something that is, or kind of goes against a core commitment of Western philosophy, which is to always seek for the truth, which you can see is emblematic in, for example, the competition between Western schools, whereas in China you have Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism really existing all together without any competition. So do you think this gap can be bridged, and can you also clarify what you try to establish with the argument, and if you think it's strong enough to do the second part?
Okay, so I think so. My answer to the first question about clarifying it is actually both. I think that depending on who you are, you can engage it in different ways. If you want to engage on it in a philosophical level, I believe we can fully engage with it. If you just want to learn about it, or sort of dabble, or as I said, and as you referenced, like sort of enhance yourself and learn and sort of just, then yeah, you can do it as a spectator, and I think that's fine. You don't have to, as I say, you don't have to accept those claims. But no, I mean, we do have there are doctrinal sort of issues between Taoism and Confucianism and Buddhism, and I would argue that the current situation, with its attitudes towards religion, has somewhat put a ceasefire to that, because it's sort of frozen. But this is something that goes back. I mean, you have sort of fusions of philosophy. So like Kang Yui's brings in a lot of sort of Taoist mysticism, but into a Confucian context. And we do that in the West, as I say. But I mean, my point is that, yes, I think academically we can engage. And I also think that the departments, in a way, can also engage. I mean, we have analytical philosophers in the same department. They aren't like at each other's throats. They don't like cancel each other out. We have Muslim and Christian theologians in religious departments that are increasingly find things to agree on. Of course, there's some things they aren't going to agree on. But I think the only way we're going to get to this is by having dialogue. My expertise, I mean, I have a master's, but I haven't done a doctorate. I don't teach in this, so I will fully admit my ignorance as to how far I think we can go. But I think it's definitely something that's worth pursuing. There's some very, very good engagement coming out, mainly out of American schools. I think Stephen Angle's very good at this, and there's also some really good engagement coming from China towards Western schools, or like trying to find links and. So arguments about setting Confucius within a system of virtue ethics, that sort of thing. So yeah, I think there can be dialogue, and I think that they can coexist to an extent. But I mean, as I say, like I hasten to add that I'm not arguing that we have to accept their premises, but rather we have to hear them out. And I don't think they're being heard out as it is. And I think that's something we can do on an individual level that sort of slowly changes things. It's a little bit like that whole doing your recycling. Do you know what I mean? Like one by one, we're maybe not going to like have a huge impact, but if we all have a go at it, it'll help. I mean, I'm not expecting the government to start fining people for bad philosophy, but that would be nice. But we'll see. Okay,
thank you. So I have two audience questions written to me that are quite similar, so I'll put them together. First is from Gustavo Alvarez. He says, well, to contextualize, I'm currently doing my thesis on a socio-political dictionary between Western liberal democracies and China. Regarding this topic, in your opinion, what are the main philosophical features that provoke a cultural gap between China and Western liberal democracies, and in consequence, political clashes and conflicts? And then Marta just sent me a question asking if whether or not you believe that there will be a time in the future where a cultural clash would happen between China and the West as Chinese culture expands its influence in European countries.
Okay, these are both good questions. Okay, with regards to the democracy element, it's a tough one. I mean, and I would argue there's probably just as much sort of structural and cultural limits on that sort of thing than there are necessarily like an ideological thing. We can look to to one example, I mean, yeah, we can look to, democratization is entirely possible within, shall we say, Confucian-based societies, because that's sort of the thing we're going on. We can look at South Korea. It's been taken a long time, and we can look at Taiwanese elections. They've been going quite well, and there's a lot of engagement in that sense. And I don't think that necessarily has involved them dropping Chinese cultural or Korean cultural sort of values. I mean, the sort of traditional Confucian values about the role of the family and that sort of thing are still very present in these countries. They're not, they haven't abandoned them wholesale. And I think rather they've viewed things through that prism and moved forwards. And I think that's key, is we have to interpret things through our own prism. We can't just adopt things. And I think that's a problem. I mean, this is a huge topic, but like getting into sort of general politics, like you can't just parachute Western liberal democracy into countries that aren't prepared for it, aren't ready for it, don't have the cultural background, but rather it needs to be situated within their own context. And as for the second question about a culture clash, what I'm talking about here is probably more to do with traditional Chinese culture that maybe isn't quite as prominent nowadays. Of course, there are elements of it. It's very hard, and that's why I'm talking about it, is that it's very hard to escape from. I mean, I think there will be a culture clash if we keep to these sort of almost ethnocentric, regional purity concept of truth rather than dialogue. And I think that dialogue is important in that sort of sense, because that's the only really way I can sort of see around this. That yeah, if the West keep going, they're absolutely no way apart from our way, and China goes absolutely no way apart from our way, then there's going to be a clash. But rather, if the next generation, which is what I think is a wonderful aim of this organisation, if the next generation of diplomats, of business people, of politicians are coming forward and they're going, well, okay, they have a slightly different take on this, they have a slightly different understanding of this, and they understand it a little bit better, then I would hope that there isn't such a clash. Though I think there's always going to be a clash, but it doesn't have to be quite as bad. That's I guess my point is.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We're almost out of time. Calvin, would you like to ask your question? He asks, some people believe that liberal Western ethnocentrism is still in need of being spread, given the global inequalities that exist within the world and the authoritative regimes that exist within various parts of the world. What do you think about this?
I think this is a very big question, and I'm semi going to chicken out of it, but I'm going to give you a sort of general statement. I think that such values are only as good as how much we commit to them. I mean, if you want to talk about liberalism and democracy, are we really implementing them in the places we're going to? Are we like is Iraq now a liberal democratic nation? Like after that intervention, I mean, that's a whole question. But yeah, I think it's problematic because we have situations where it almost seems selective, our criticism of countries that are authoritarian. So, for example, as long as you're on our side, like Iraq's another good example. For a long time, Saddam Hussein was seen as our friend because he was against the Iranians, who were seen as the bigger enemy. But then he sort of like rebelled, like turned against it a bit, and that caused problems. So, I think that the problem with the current state of sort of, shall we say, Western liberal democracy is that it's not really, the people that proclaim it aren't really that passionate about it. I mean, there's definitely some people out there, and that's great. But I mean, we're seeing a rolling back of it within our society. We're seeing a rise in populism and an abandonment in a way of these liberal values. And whether that's right or wrong, that's up to the individuals. But yeah, I mean, like, as I said, so going back to the thing, if we're going to turn around and say, oh, North Korea is so bad because it does X, Y, Z, and then we have allies like Saudi Arabia that are doing very similar things to X, Y, Z, like beheading political opponents, arresting people, this is going to be a problem for anybody to believe in that. So yeah, basically, to sum it up, I believe any ideology is only as good as your commitment and your willingness to genuinely implement it rather than use it as an excuse for something else.
Calvin said exceptionally he would like to ask a follow-up question.
Firstly, thank you for the presentation, your response. It is appreciated. To what extent do you feel as though having a more collectivist nation-state dynamic would be conducive toward sort of commitment toward these principles that would be shared across the country, as opposed to potentially a more individualistic stance that is currently had within a fair portion of Western democracies, we call them?
Yeah, I mean, this is, it's probably a little bit beyond my remit. It's something I've thought about, like, absolutely, but it's not not something and I will not claim to be an expert in this. I think, yeah, I think in a way the point about collectivism and sort of a more mutual support based, like a familiar, whether you like, yeah, the collectivist sort of approach. Yeah, I mean, I feel that individualism, the way we've got it right now, is almost a one-way path to populism. We have this idea that that we are entitled, that we have these viewpoints, and that only like that we're right, and like get rid of the rest of the world. I mean, like, in my opinion, Brexit's a very good example of that. Is that it's like it is right because I say it's right. I mean, there's arguments for and against Brexit, but the majority of people weren't making that based upon a considered, shall we say, values-based thing. It was an extremely lot of it was based upon, from my personal observation, was based upon this idea that oh, they're doing this and they're doing that, and it was like a bit like sort of the Trump sort of thing, where you've got this idea that the Mexicans are this huge threat, you need a wall against them. Like, it's very easy, rather than a general consideration of the actual situation. I think if we had a more collectivist thing, and a more sort of, I think David Cameron called it big society, despite it almost being traditionally not necessarily in keeping with sort of more liberal things, but it would actually be better because there's a lot easier to implement on that level. And I think it's about finding that balance. I don't think that sort of like libertarian sort of anarcho-capitalist sort of individualism is really freedom for anybody. And yeah, but beyond that, this is a huge topic, and it's a very good topic, and thank you for the question. But they're my current thoughts on it. I'm sorry if I couldn't do any more.
Thank you, Thomas. You are getting some tough questions from the audience. Now, I'm still getting questions coming in. However, we will have to stop the webinar soon, and the final question will be coming from Patricia. Patricia, if you want to ask.
Yes, thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Thomas, for this really stimulating conversation. I wanted to know your opinion about what do you think could accelerate or make possible the inclusion of not so much Eurocentric history or philosophy in Western educational systems, like, for instance, in high schools, more or less. Thank you.
Okay, so are you talking about like specific materials, or what we can do to change that?
What we could do to change that, because for instance, I studied in Barcelona in an Italian school, and I didn't know anything about the implications or consequences of the Treaty of Versailles for China, and I only came to know that when I went to India to study international relations, for instance. So I'm asking what we could do to kind of introduce philosophy or history in the educational systems, in particular in Europe.
So first of all, every country is going to want to teach sort of the most related history. Yeah, I mean, like in the UK, I'm going to learn about the kings and queens of England, and then we're going to move on to other things. But I think what is increasingly important, especially in historical scholarship, I mean, we're talking like recent monographs, is we're learning about these transnational intellectual networks that are not just coming out of, like, we can't say that the British invented this, because actually, well, somebody came from this and they did this, and we learn all about that. And I think joining those dots and being able to, and teaching it in a way that situates history within this sort of nexus of ideas, of traditions, of exchanges. I think maybe that's the key point, is exchange is the way forwards. And it's a tough thing, and I don't really think it's ever going to be that popular, because, I mean, from the British perspective, we've had like a pretty nationalist turn in our teaching, that we only want to be taught like very English authors and that sort of thing. So, and lots of countries want that, but I guess it would just be it'd be marketing it in sort of a way that I've tried to do, and just be like, look, we need to know about other countries because we're going to have to deal with them, and move forwards like that. I mean, philosophically, yeah, I mean, I don't really like sort of, not like, I feel like this part of the problem is that we often have non-Western philosophies reduced to literature, or they're reduced to history. So we see Confucius as a text rather than as a thinker, or we see him as a historical figure. But we can obviously also, that I would still rather see him as a historical figure in the curriculum than I would completely exclude it. So yeah, that sort of thing. I mean, it's impossible to cover everything. I mean, and don't get me wrong, but my point is that it'd just be nice to be like a little bit more varied, a little bit more spicy, so to speak.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Thomas, for all your great insights. There are a lot of people who have expressed how interesting they found this webinar. Thank you, everyone, for attending. This will be the end of this webinar, and the end of European Guanxi's webinars for this year. See you next year. Have a great time with your family. Stay safe and stay healthy, and see you then. Thank you.
Thank you very much.